Shabbat Shalom, Chodesh Tov, Chanukah Sameach. It doesn't happen that often. We have to enjoy the wonderful trifecta that we get. In my life, I have had quite a few different jobs. I have sold fruit and veg from the back of a truck. I have done data entry for an optometrist. I have done day labor for various neighbors and friends. I worked as a sandwich artist in Subway. I also was a delivery driver for Domino's Pizza. I worked as a secretary when I was in university, and then of course I was an English teacher, and now a rabbi. What's next? Retirement. Because all the other jobs I've quit. This is the only job that I have never quit. And I have no intention of quitting until it becomes the more appropriate thing to do in my years ahead. But that ability to quit was incredibly important. That ability to quit is why I had jobs rather than servitude. Slavery, avadim hayinu, slavery plays a big part in our national legacy. We talk about the slavery of Egypt, and here we stand at the edge of the slavery of Egypt. But I want to talk about the first slave in Egypt, the first Jewish slave in Egypt, and that was Joseph, right? Joseph comes down in chains. He is sold by his brothers. He is brought down into Egypt, and he is sold to Potiphar. There are some problems with Potiphar's wife. If this was just a job, and there were no actual discriminatory lawsuits available for protection, what would Joseph's best response have been under those circumstances with Mrs. Potiphar pressing her advances? He should have quit. Sexual harassment, if there is such protections, but that's relatively new. And even today, unfortunately, many men that are sexually harassed do not get the same support that they should. But if there had not been such protections, he should have quit. Why didn't he quit? He's a slave. He didn't have the option to just say, take this job and have someone else staff it. He was forced to stay there day after day after day as she continued to press her advances all the way up to the crisis that eventually lands him in prison. Now, in prison, is he still a slave? Well, yes. Actually, he does have a job in prison, that he is in charge of the other people that are there, the other prisoners. Is he free to leave when he wants? No. He is indeed still serving a form of servitude even while in prison. But then comes in Miketz, in our parasha this week, his big break. Finally, the cupbearer for Pharaoh has reason to mention this Hebrew who can interpret dreams. It's never good and never bad to mention a good appointment to the king. It gets you good points. And Joseph is brought before Pharaoh, and now he is free. Right? No. We often conceive of him as being free. Certainly the language is incredibly effusive. He is brought before Pharaoh. They give him a shave and new clothes. Once he has demonstrated his abilities, they dress him in all the royal garments that are befitting a man who is now second in charge of all of Egypt. Rings and gold and all of this good stuff, a fancy chariot. Okay, it's nice. But is he free? Well, let's take a little bit of a snippet. What happens years later? Oh, yes? Okay, so when time comes for Jacob to be buried in Machpelah, back up in Hebron, Joseph has to ask, nearly beg permission from the Pharaoh to be allowed to go. The burial of Jacob is no problem, but for Joseph to leave the country, well, he needs to get Pharaoh's stamp in his passport before he can do that. And he must return. He doesn't have the option to just go and stay there and now resettle in the land of his ancestors and be in the place of Abraham, Isaac, and his father Jacob. Joseph goes and he returns, and Pharaoh sends an armed escort with him for his protection, of course. What are all of the servants called in Hebrew for those that work for Pharaoh? Avadim. Avadim, the same word that is used for slaves. Now, this is one of those slippery words in Hebrew that can have multiple meanings. It can mean servant, or it can mean slave. And certainly in the Egyptian passages, I believe it is meant to have both connotations. That those who serve Pharaoh are not free to just leave when they don't like the job anymore. That those who serve Pharaoh are in fact bound to Pharaoh at Pharaoh's pleasure. If he likes you, you stay on the job. If he doesn't like you, he throws you in prison and then decides what to do with you. Sometimes it'll be okay, you'll come back. Sometimes you'll meet your maker like the baker and be gone. Yes?
Don't we have something like that if you're in the military and you decide to leave?
Oh, you mean deserting, desertion in the middle of the military? Yes, that is a big deal. When you've taken on the responsibility to defend a nation, leaving in the middle of that responsibility is generally frowned upon. But that is indeed why service in the military, which in this country is voluntary, is such a huge choice to make, because you are signing on the dotted line for an extended period of tell me what to do. And it is very much because of that that makes it different from many other types of jobs. But let's get back to Joseph. So Joseph leaves the pit and becomes the most noble of slaves in the entire country. But make no mistake, he is still a slave. He is still a servant to Pharaoh and bound to Pharaoh and not at liberty to say, well, thank you for getting him out of jail, and I'm so happy I could help you with this interpretation of the dream, but you know what I'd like to do most right now is head back to Canaan and visit with my family. See you later. Pharaoh does not give him that option. It's great, you're useful to me, you're staying right here where you can be of use to me. You don't get a choice in this. Which is very funny, because the rest of the Egyptians kind of sort of did. Oh, sure, Pharaoh could press them into to forced labor, but then that was a standard form of taxes in most of the ancient world, and really all the way up until the early modern period, even within the Western world. But generally speaking, if you were a farmer in ancient Egypt, you had more freedom than Joseph. If you wanted to plant lima beans, you could plant lima beans. If you wanted to plant wheat, you could plant wheat. Pharaoh didn't get to tell you what to plant until Joseph got a hold of them. You see, in next week's Torah portion, we get the wrap-up to the whole famine scenario. This week, it's all looking great, right? This week, Joseph has arranged the economy of all of Egypt to make sure that there is plenty of surplus that is being stored in order that when the famine hits, there will be food. And indeed, there is food enough to even be able to feed people who come from out of country. But as the famine wears on, the average peasant, the average farmer, does not have a granary like those that were built by the government under Joseph's instruction. And the average farmer eventually has to go to buy food. And they go to Pharaoh and they buy food. And then they run out of cash. And so they go to Pharaoh and they sell their livestock for food. And then they run out of livestock. So they go to Pharaoh and what's left to sell? Themselves and their land. And they sell themselves and their land into servitude in perpetuity to Pharaoh. The entirety of the nation of Egypt becomes enslaved during Joseph's rule as second slave to Pharaoh. Joseph actually enslaves the rest of the nation. Now, was this entirely his idea? Was this carrying out Pharaoh's will? The Torah does not make that abundantly clear. But what is clear is that by the end of the famine period, the people go where Pharaoh tells them to go, they plant what Pharaoh tells them to plant, and they have to pay a proportion of everything they grow to Pharaoh as a form of taxation for the privilege of being allowed to work the land that they have given to Pharaoh now forever. So indeed, there are many people who argue that when the Egyptians become resentful of the Jewish people, the Israelites, who get special treatment under Joseph's hand and who get special land and special permissions, that we should not be surprised that once the protector of Joseph, once that particular Pharaoh is off stage and the new Pharaoh comes on, that he is able to make a lot of political capital out of enslaving the Israelites, who were descended from the guy that was now conveniently being blamed for the enslavement of the rest of the Egyptians. You'll notice, of course, Pharaoh didn't let the rest of the Egyptians go free, but the Israelites were a convenient scapegoat, as we often seem to be, for exactly the indentured servitude, the enslavement, whatever you want to call it, for the average Egyptian person. What better way to get them off your back than to point them at someone else and say, yes, but look, the Israelites are even lower than you. It's a beautiful time-honored technique. It's been going around for a few thousand years. But that meant that the Egyptians now, rank and file, were slaves. Oh, they had a little bit of freedom. After all, they could keep 4/5 of whatever they had sold, but they couldn't use it to buy back their land. They couldn't use it to buy back their independence. If Pharaoh told them to move from this part of Egypt to that part of Egypt, they had to move. When God comes along and says, let my people go, it is primarily this type of freedom that God is trying to reintroduce to his people, and indeed back into that corner of the world. To recognize that freedom is actually essential to the human condition. Even the Egyptians prior to this were free, and they allowed themselves to be enslaved, or indeed took the opportunity to enslave an entire nation, for the perceived gain that it would bring. But the thing is, with the modern tools of economics, we know that enslaving a population is one of the least beneficial things you can do, not just to the population that you put in chains, but to the population that are exploiting the people that are in chains. Slavery is a tragedy not only for those that are enslaved, but also for the rest of the country, even if they are not officially slaves in that economy. Slavery, a lack of freedom, dries up the opportunity for opportunity. It dries up the chance for labor to move where it is most needed, for labor to follow the best opportunities for each person and family, for labor to bring talents to bear in whichever place it might best be able to suit, rather than in a ditch planting the beans that the Pharaoh told you to plant. The more freedom that people have to choose their own course, to chart their own path, to make their own decisions, without fear of either being whipped by a taskmaster or of suffering deprivation and poverty, the better the society flourishes. Time and time again, this has been borne out not only through the equations of the economists, but also in the real world. One of the great struggles in the 20th century was between the relatively free market capitalism of the West and the kind of directed economy of the Soviet Union bloc, and we saw how that worked out. That doesn't mean, however, that we should rest on our laurels. Freedom still comes in degrees, and for many of us, those freedoms are greatly limited. For those that still have to work in positions that do not provide them with the opportunity to truly explore what their talents are, where they could best be used, and how to do so in a way that doesn't create fear, anxiety, or illness for themselves, this is still a crisis that needs to be resolved. Freedom is something that comes in degrees, and we need to make sure that those degrees are increasing. Joseph had a hand in enslaving a nation. We, his descendants, have had a hand in freeing ourselves and freeing nations around the world, both directly and through inspiration. But that job is not done, and that job does not occur just on the macro scale. Look for ways for yourself to find the ability to be free. Look for the ways for yourself to help your neighbor and others to have that same freedom, that independence, that opportunity, that chance to truly live as they choose to live, and to do so in a way that will bring goodness for them and for all of us as well. Shabbat Shalom, Chodesh Tov, Chanukah Sameach.